The call came in at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact minute because I was still awake, still in the study with the lights low and a glass of something I hadn't touched in 40 minutes, going over supplier contracts that didn't need my attention as much as I was pretending they did. Taemin's voice came through the line flat, procedural, the voice he uses when he thinks a thing is nothing. I have learned over 11 years that his flat voice is the one I should trust the least. A car stopped on the private access road along the eastern edge of my family's land, 40 minutes outside Incheon, a road that doesn't exist on any map a tourist would carry, that doesn't show up on rideshare apps, that has exactly one purpose, to move things and people my family doesn't want seen moving, cash, documents that shouldn't cross a border in the light, men who need to disappear for a while, and men who need to disappear permanently. Nobody stops there by accident. I have believed that for 11 years, and I have never once been wrong about it. Not since the songs started testing the edges of what belongs to us, feeling for weak seams the way a man runs his thumb along a wall looking for the place the paint is thinnest. My father used to say a territory only stays yours as long as you're willing to bleed for the edges of it. I hated him for saying things like that when I was young. I understand him better now, which frightens me more than it should. I almost didn't go myself. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have. 6 months ago, this would have ended with a phone call to Taemin and a folder on my desk by morning, and I would have absorbed whatever needed absorbing without ever leaving the building. That's how I've run things since my father stepped back, from a height at a distance, the way you're supposed to run an empire if you want to keep your hands clean enough to still be useful in a negotiation. Distance is a discipline. I have practiced it the way other men practice languages or instruments, until it became the only fluency I truly trusted myself to have. But something in the report snagged, a rental car. American plates on the paperwork Taemin read off before I'd even finished pulling my coat from the back of my chair. A single occupant, female. And the detail that made me set the glass down entirely, made me stop pretending I was going to finish those contracts tonight. She hadn't called anyone. 20 minutes stranded, alone, on a dark road in a country that wasn't hers, and she hadn't reached for a single lifeline. No rideshare app open on a cracked screen, no frantic calls to an embassy hotline. Nothing. That kind of self-containment interests me. It shouldn't have. I've built a career on reading the exact moment fear breaks a person open, and the idea of someone standing in the dark without reaching for help was, if I'm honest with myself now in a way I wasn't allowing myself to be then, the first small crack in a night that would end with far larger ones. I told myself it was a security concern. A woman who doesn't panic is a woman who might be trained to not panic, and a trained woman on my family's private road at that hour deserved more than a phone call handled by someone else. I have spent enough years around men who lie for a living to know precisely when I am lying to myself, and I recognized it even then, in the study, glass still cold in my hand, and I went anyway. That is what I told myself. I have gotten very good over the years at telling myself things that are only half true and calling the whole of it fact. I filed the thought away the way I file away everything that doesn't serve an immediate purpose, and I told Taemin to bring the car around. The rain hadn't started yet. That would come later, closer to 2 in the morning, once everything else had already started falling apart. For now the night was just heavy, thick with the particular stillness of a Korean summer that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to break. Cicadas loud enough to swallow the sound of our engines, hot asphalt breathing its heat back up into the dark, the smell of it rising through the open window even before I'd rolled it down, diesel and dust and something green underneath, the forest pressing close on both sides of that road the way it always does out there, indifferent to whatever business moved through it. The road itself seemed to know it didn't belong to strangers the way it does, the way land remembers who's poured blood into it. The convoy slowed 100 meters out. I saw her before she saw us, caught in the wash of our headlights before she'd registered the sound of 4 engines cutting through the cicadas, arms crossed tight over her chest, chin lifted at an angle that had nothing submissive in it, standing beside the open driver's door of a rental car that was very clearly not going to move again tonight. She looked like a woman daring the dark itself to try something. I remember thinking that with something close to admiration, before I remembered that admiration wasn't a currency I dealt in anymore. I have not admired anything in a very long time, not since I was young enough that admiration hadn't yet been trained out of me by men who considered it a weakness. I noted that fact, the way I note most anomalies, carefully, without allowing myself to sit with it for longer than the moment required. I lowered my window 3 inches, no further. I don't offer more of myself than a situation requires. Not my face, not my voice, not the details of who's asking. 3 inches has always been enough to end most conversations before they start. "You're on Kang property," I said. "Get in the car." She didn't move. That was the first thing wrong about her, not the defiance itself. I've had defiance thrown at me before, from men twice her size who thought their bravado would buy them 30 extra seconds of leverage before I closed the conversation permanently. This was different. She looked past me at the convoy, 4 black cars, 6 of my men visible, more firepower parked on that stretch of dead asphalt than her rental had produced in horsepower its entire working life, and she didn't flinch. She calculated. I watched her do it, watched her eyes move car to car, man to man, and land back on me like she'd decided, in under 4 seconds, exactly how much of a threat I actually was, and had filed it somewhere useful, the way I file things. "I don't get in cars with strangers who don't introduce themselves," she said. Behind me, I heard Taemin shift his weight against the frame of the open door. Waiting the way he always waits, for the version of my temper he's only seen twice in 11 years of service, and both times, the men on the receiving end of it needed hospitals they never checked into. I didn't feel it now. That was the second thing wrong about her. I have never in my adult life had someone speak to me like that, and felt nothing but a strange, unfamiliar curiosity in response. I opened the door myself. I don't often stand in the open like this. It's a liability I don't usually permit myself, an unnecessary exposure of a body my enemies would very much like a clean shot at, on a road with no lighting and no cameras, at an hour when accidents are easiest to arrange and hardest to trace. But I stepped out anyway, into humidity that stuck my shirt to my spine within seconds of leaving the car, and I let her get a full, unhurried look at exactly who she was speaking to. Most people's faces do something specific in that moment. Recognition, usually, even foreigners have heard the name Kang if they've spent more than a week in certain circles of this city. Fear, if they understand what the name actually means beneath the legitimate holding companies and charitable foundations. Calculation, if they're smart enough to be afraid and thinking simultaneously about how that fear might be turned into leverage. Her face did none of it. She looked at my suit first, noted the cut, the fabric, filed it away the way you'd note the make of an expensive car you had no intention of riding in, and then she looked at my face, level, unhurried, like she was still deciding whether I was worth the energy of being afraid of. "You have 5 seconds to tell me who you are," she said, "or I'm calling the embassy. Your phone is at 4%. Something flickered across her expression then, not fear, irritation. Irritation that I knew that detail at all, that someone had apparently checked and reported it back to me before I'd even stepped out of the car. I watched her decide not to ask how I knew. I clicked my lighter open, shut. A habit older than most of the men standing behind me on that road, something for my hands to do when the rest of me needs to stay perfectly, deliberately still. My father used to tell me it made me look nervous. I've never once believed him. It's the opposite. It's the only permitted movement in a body that has trained itself not to need any others. "Kang Ji-hoon," I said. It cost me nothing to hand her the name. Everyone eventually learns it, one way or another, and there was something almost freeing in saying it to a person who clearly had no idea what it meant yet. This road doesn't appear on any map you'll find in your rental company's glove box. That should tell you something about the company you've stumbled into tonight. Stumbled is generous. My GPS died along with everything else about 20 minutes ago. I almost let the corner of my mouth move. I stopped it before it started, the way I've stopped every unnecessary expression on my face for the better part of a decade. That was when I saw the duffel bag. It sat in her back seat, old canvas, a faded airline tag still clipped to one strap, thrown there in what looked like a hurry and then apparently forgotten in the panic of a dead engine on a dark road. I don't fully know what made me look twice. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that's kept me breathing through 3 attempts on my own life and 1 years earlier on my father's. But I went very still. "What's in the bag?" It wasn't a question. I watched her hear that it wasn't a question, watched something shift in the set of her shoulders as she understood, for the first time since I'd stepped out of my car, that whatever conversation we'd been having up to that point had just ended, and a different one had begun. "Clothes," she said, a half second too fast. Why does it matter? I didn't answer her. I nodded once, and Taemin moved toward the rental without waiting for permission from either of us. The interior of my car is cold, 66 degrees, never warmer, because heat makes men careless, and I have never once permitted myself the luxury of carelessness, not in a house, not in a boardroom, not in the back seat of a moving vehicle. She sat across from me with her arms folded tight, watching Seoul's skyline start to bleed neon through the tinted glass, jaw set like she was doing the math on exactly how far she now was from anywhere she understood the rules of. I watched her hands instead of the skyline. Hands tell you more than faces do. Hers hadn't stopped moving since the door closed, smoothing the same fold of her sleeve over and over, a small private motion she likely didn't know she was making. I had the folder open before she noticed I'd taken it out of the bag. It wasn't clothes. It was paper, dense, organized in the particular obsessive way of a man who'd spent his career building cases no one wanted him to finish. A private investigator's file, tabbed, cross-referenced, a name on the folder itself that made something in my chest go colder than December ever manages. Colder than the air conditioning in that car, colder than anything I'd felt and longer than I could accurately count. Bennett R. Case File, Kang Vehicular Incident, 1997. My mother died on a road very much like the one I'd just pulled this woman off of, 27 years ago this coming October. I was told it was an accident. I have built an entire empire on top of that single word, accident, because to question it meant questioning the grief my father built the rest of his life around, and I loved him too much, once, before other things replaced the loving, to take that certainty away from him. I turned a page. My own family's name appeared, cross-referenced against a shipping manifest I recognized instantly because I'd forged half of it myself at 19 years old, cleaning up a mess that was never mine to clean but became mine anyway, the way everything in this family eventually becomes mine to clean. My hands did not shake turning that page. I want to be precise about that, because everything else in me had already begun to. "You're not going to Incheon tonight," I said. My voice didn't shake. It never does. But I heard the register of it shift, just slightly, something flattening out beneath the words that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. And I watched her hear it too, watched her uncross her arms slowly, like she was recalculating the danger of the situation in real time. "Excuse me." I closed the folder before she could see any more of it. My phone buzzed once against my thigh, a message from Taemin, sent from the front seat not 10 feet away, because some things in this family you don't say aloud even inside your own soundproofed car. Songs people were asking about a Bennett 3 days ago. Same surname. I angled the screen away from her before she could catch even a reflection of it in the window glass. 3 days. 3 days before her rental engine had conveniently failed on a road with no traffic and no witnesses. I did not believe in that kind of coincidence. I have never once believed in that kind of coincidence, and I was not going to start on the night I found her standing in the dark, refusing to be afraid of me. The private elevator to the 61st floor is the only space in the entire building with no cameras. I had it built that way myself after the assassination attempt on my father in 2019. A single blind spot by design, the 1 square meter of my life that no one, not even my own security team, can watch or record. I don't know why I noticed, riding up in silence beside her, that the space felt different with someone else standing in it, fuller, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical dimensions of the room. I didn't examine the thought. I rarely allow myself to examine thoughts that don't come with an immediate use attached. The doors opened onto glass and steel and a Seoul skyline laid out like something conquered rather than something merely lived beside. No photographs anywhere in that penthouse. I'd had the last of them removed years ago, when looking at my mother's face stopped being something I could afford between meetings, between funerals, between the version of my life that required me to feel nothing in order to function at all. Staff moved along the edges of the room, appearing and dissolving with the practiced silence I'd trained into them, bowing without meeting my eyes because I'd trained that into them too. I watched her take it in, watched her eyes travel floor to ceiling, marble to glass, and understood, in the particular way I understand most things now, that she was realizing there was no door on that level that led back out to a life she recognized as her own. "You're not going to hurt me," she said. Not quite a question. Something closer to a test she needed me to pass out loud. No, I said, and meant it more fully than I'd meant almost anything and longer than I could remember, though I didn't yet understand why the very idea of hurting her had turned my stomach the way it had, sudden and visceral, the moment the words left her mouth. Mrs. Han came forward then, 60 years in my family's service, a face carved from decades of practiced patience, and set a folded document on the low glass table between us without a single word, the way she's done 1,000 times before, with contracts far less complicated than the one now sitting between us. Amara looked at it, looked at me. I said nothing. I let the silence sit exactly as long as it took for her to reach for the folder herself, because some decisions I have learned not to make for people, even when I already know which decision they're going to reach. That has always been the difference, I think, between the men in my family who ruled through fear and the ones who lasted. The ones who lasted knew when silence did more work than an order ever could. It wasn't what she expected. I could see that shift happen behind her eyes, watched her read faster once she understood what she was actually holding. Not a ransom demand, not paperwork for a debt she didn't know she owed. A marriage contract. 6 months minimum, legally binding under both Korean and American law, drafted by attorneys who bill more per hour than most people in this city earn in a month. You want me to marry you? I need the songs to believe I already have. Rain had started against the glass behind me by then, fine, constant, blurring the city into smeared gold and red like a photograph left too long in developing fluid. I kept my back to the window on purpose. It's easier to read a person's face when your own stays in shadow, and I needed, more than I wanted to admit even to myself, to read every flicker that crossed hers. The men who killed my mother 27 years ago, I said, are the same men whose surname appears on every page of the file your father spent the last year of his life building. You didn't know that when you packed that bag. You didn't know your rental car dying on that road tonight wasn't luck. I let that settle in the space between us before I continued, watching it land, watching her jaw tighten around a grief she hadn't finished processing. A wife of Kang cannot be touched without triggering a war neither side is currently prepared to survive. You are safer married to me for 6 months than you are anywhere in this country, alone, for the next 6 hours. And if I say no, I set a pen on the table in front of her, precisely the way I set every object I intend for someone else to pick up. I didn't answer her. There are certain questions I have learned, through long and expensive experience, not to dignify with a response I can't guarantee I'll be able to keep. I walked out of the room before she could ask it a second time. I went to my father's old study instead of my own that night, which is something I do rarely and never admit to doing. The room hasn't changed since he stepped back from the business. The same lacquered desk, the same shelf of ledgers no one reads anymore, the same framed calligraphy above the window that he commissioned the year I was born, a single character meaning endurance, as though he'd known even then exactly what kind of life he was choosing for me before I'd had any say in the matter. I stood there for a long time without turning on the light, listening to the rain against a different set of windows than the ones in my own study, letting the familiar weight of that room settle over me the way it always has since I was a boy too young to understand why my father spent so many nights in it alone. I have never once in my adult life told anyone what it cost me to grow up in a house that trained grief out of me before I understood what grief even was. My father wept once, at my mother's funeral, and never again in front of me after that. I used to think that was strength. I have started, somewhere in the last 6 days, to wonder if it was simply the first and most thorough lesson he ever taught me, that love in this family is a liability you learn to bury before it can be used against you. I thought about the woman 2 floors below, signing a contract that made her legally mine while believing, correctly, that I was the most dangerous thing to happen to her since she'd landed in this country. I thought about the specific, quiet defiance in her voice on that dark road, and the fact that I had not, in 11 years, met anyone, not a rival, not an ally, not a woman my father's people had paraded in front of me at a dozen calculated dinners, who had made me stop and reconsider my own reflexes the way she had in under 4 seconds standing beside a dead rental car. I told myself it was strategy. I have gotten very good at that particular lie. Choi Bae-ho had been skimming from 3 of my warehouses for 11 months before the numbers finally told me enough of a story to act on. I found out on a Tuesday, reading through inventory reports at 2 in the morning because sleep has never come easily to me and I have learned to make the hours useful instead of resenting them. I dealt with it on a Thursday, in the smoking room off the east hallway, because I wanted the matter closed before the wedding announcement went public, and I did not want that particular category of ugliness anywhere near the week I had planned. He came in already sweating, which told me he already suspected why I'd summoned him. Good instincts, wasted on bad decisions. That has always been the most common failure I see in men who work for me. They can read a room perfectly and still walk into the fire because greed talks louder than instinct ever does. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I told him, in the exact tone I'd used to order a coffee I had no intention of drinking. Precisely what I knew, precisely what his skimming had cost the family, and precisely what would happen to the restaurant lease his younger sister depended on if I ever heard his name again in connection with anything I owned. I watched the information land on his face in stages, first the specific numbers, which told him I'd known for months, not days. Then the mention of his sister, which told him I knew exactly where his loyalty could be reached even when his own self-preservation failed him. He left that room a shade grayer than the one he'd walked in wearing. No one touched him. No one needed to. That has always been the entire point of the reputation I've spent 11 years constructing. A reputation loud enough that the violence itself rarely has to appear. I lit a cigarette I had no real intention of finishing and turned toward the door, and that was when I found her, Amara, standing in the hallway, having clearly witnessed the last 30 seconds of it, one hand still resting against the doorframe like she hadn't yet decided whether the correct response was to run or to stay exactly where she was. Our eyes held. I have stared down rival bosses across negotiation tables. I have stared down corrupt prosecutors who thought their office made them untouchable. I stared down my own father in the last fully conscious moment before he named me heir over my older cousin, a decision that cost our family more blood over the following 2 years than I've ever told anyone the true total of. None of them held my gaze the way she held it in that doorway, not out of fear, and not quite out of defiance either, but out of something closer to assessment, as though she were recalculating a number she'd thought she'd already solved and was surprised to find still incomplete. I looked away first. I don't remember, with any real certainty, the last time that happened. I stood there afterward, cigarette burning down between my fingers, and thought about the specific weight of her attention longer than any reasonable accounting of my time that night should have allowed. It was past 2 in the morning when Mrs. Han quietly informed me the light was still burning in the east study. I told myself I was going to check on the contract, not on her. I have grown, over the years, disturbingly skilled at telling myself things that are only half true and calling the whole of it fact. She was alone at the desk when I reached the doorway. One candle lit, though the room had perfectly functional electric light within easy reach, the pen moving across the signature line in small, deliberate strokes, like she needed to physically feel the shape of each letter to believe the choice was genuinely hers and not simply one more decision the night had made for her. I stood there and watched the candlelight move against the side of her face and thought, absurdly, that I had never once in my life allowed a single flame to burn unattended in that house, and had somehow not moved to extinguish it. I watched from the doorway longer than I should have allowed myself to. When she finally looked up and found me there, she went still the particular way prey goes still, not frightened exactly, but suddenly and completely aware of how long she'd been unobserved and now clearly wasn't. "How long have you been there?" I didn't answer. Some silences, I've learned, are a kindness. That one, if I'm honest with the version of myself writing this down now, was closer to a confession, because I simply didn't have language yet for what it meant that I'd stood in that doorway for 4 full minutes in my own home, watching a woman I'd known for less than a week sign her name inside the architecture of my war, and felt something move through my chest that I hadn't authorized, hadn't planned for, and could not yet name with any accuracy. I left before the silence could ask anything further of either of us. The Chun Foundation Gala is the kind of event where every alliance and rivalry running beneath Seoul's underworld gets rehearsed in public, dressed in silk and orchestral strings, so that no one has to say aloud what everyone in the room already understands perfectly well. I had not brought a woman to one of those events in 6 years. My absence from that particular tradition had, I knew, become its own kind of rumor, one my father's old associates still brought up at dinners I no longer bothered attending. Amara wore navy silk, the exact color of the harbor at night, and the moment we crossed the threshold I put my hand at the small of her back, not affection, or not only affection, though I noted with some discomfort how difficult it had become to separate the two. It was territory, a signal broadcast to every man in that ballroom who might have been wondering whether the whispers of my engagement were strategy or truth. I felt every eye in that room recalibrate around us within the first 30 seconds, felt the particular hush that falls over a room full of dangerous men when they realize a piece on the board has moved somewhere they hadn't accounted for. Song-hye found us within the hour, as I'd known she would. Minister Song's niece, sharp-tongued, dangerous in the particular way of women who have never once had to fire a gun themselves because they've always had men willing to do it on their behalf. "How resourceful of you, Ji-hoon," she said, her eyes traveling the length of Amara's dress like an appraisal at auction, picking up strays off the highway now. I felt Amara's spine straighten beneath my palm a half-second before I felt my own temper begin to move. "Careful," I said, my voice never rising, never once needing to. "The last person who insulted something of mine in public is currently renegotiating his warehouse lease from a hospital bed." It wasn't true. Chibe-ho was not, to my knowledge, anywhere near a hospital. But Haiti didn't know that, and the color that drained from her face in that moment was worth considerably more to me than any strictly accurate statement could have been. She excused herself within the minute, and I watched her retreat across the marble floor with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just closed a negotiation without raising his voice once. I didn't look away from Amara once during the entire exchange. There was something in me that needed her, specifically to see that whatever coldness lived in me now had finally found a direction, and that direction wasn't aimed at her. Across the room, near the bar, I noticed a man in a gray suit lower his phone from his ear and keep it, very deliberately, angled in our direction. I filed the detail away. I did not yet understand how quickly I would need it again. Later, when the orchestra had shifted into something slower and the room had thinned to the people too drunk or too desperate to leave early, Amara stepped away from a cluster of my associates' wives and found the balcony instead. I followed her out, telling myself it was security, though I no longer fully believed the things I told myself by that point in the evening. The city spread out beneath us in grids of light, the Han River cutting through it black and indifferent, carrying whatever the night wanted to carry away. She had her arms crossed again, the same posture from the highway, I noticed, the same instinct toward self-containment that had first caught my attention on that dead stretch of road. "They all look at me like I'm a problem you're solving," she said, not turning to face me. "You are," I said. "The most interesting one I've had in years." She did turn then, and something passed between us on that balcony that I have no adequate language for, not desire alone, though it was present, and not gratitude alone, though that lived there too. Something closer to recognition, the particular unsettling comfort of being seen clearly by someone with no reason to flatter what they saw. I did not touch her. I wanted to, with an intensity that unsettled me more than any threat that week had produced, and I did not, because some lines I had not yet earned the right to cross. The service road behind the Chun estate isn't lit. I chose it for the drive home specifically because it's fast, because it's private, because in 11 years of using it, no one had ever dared to use it against me. They used it against me that night. The first shot took out the rear windshield before I'd even fully registered the second car pulling alongside ours, headlights off, engine screaming through the dark, the driver's window already sliding down with the black silhouette of a rifle barrel emerging from it in a motion I recognized before my mind had finished processing what it was seeing. I didn't think. Thinking would have cost seconds I didn't have. I threw my body across the seat and drove her down beneath me, glass raining across my back and shoulders in a shower of sound like static made suddenly and violently solid, and I felt the graze take my shoulder half a second later, heat first, then the wet spreading warmth of it, then nothing at all, because pain has never once been the thing I process first in a moment like that. The thing I processed first was her face. "Are you hit?" My voice didn't sound entirely like mine. "Look at me. Are you hit?" She was shaking beneath me, glass caught in her hair, one hand fisted white-knuckled into what remained of my jacket. But she shook her head, and something in my chest unclenched so violently and so suddenly that it nearly took the remaining wind out of me worse than the bullet graze had managed. Taemin was already returning fire through the shattered rear window, his voice a controlled shout of coordinates and instructions to the two cars trailing behind us. The second vehicle peeled off hard into the dark, tires screaming against wet asphalt, gone before our backup could even close the distance to the intersection. The whole exchange lasted perhaps 11 seconds. It felt, from beneath the weight of my own body pressed over hers, like something closer to an hour. I didn't move off her, not yet, not until I'd checked, with my own hands this time, twice more, that every part of her was exactly where it was supposed to be and not 1 inch of her had been touched by anything that came out of that other car. The drive back to the penthouse took 11 minutes. I counted every one of them, the way I count things when my mind needs somewhere controlled to go. Taemin drove faster than protocol allowed, weaving through side streets he'd mapped years ago for exactly this contingency, and I sat in the back with my ruined jacket pressed to my shoulder and Amara's hand locked around my forearm hard enough to leave marks I would find the next morning and not mind finding. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't anything useful to say yet, not until we were inside walls I trusted, behind a door I controlled, in a room where I could finally allow the adrenaline to recede enough to feel the full weight of what had almost happened. I kept my eyes on the passing street lights instead of on her, because looking at her in that moment, with her hair still full of glass and her hands still shaking against my arm, threatened to undo something in me I wasn't ready to name in the back of a moving car. Back at the penthouse, the wound was worse than I'd allowed myself to register in the car. Mrs. Han wanted to call the physician on retainer immediately. I told her to wait outside instead, a decision I still can't fully account for except to say that I did not, for reasons I couldn't have explained to anyone who asked me that night, want a stranger's hands on me before hers. Amara knelt in front of me on the marble, hands trembling, pressing the silk of my ruined tie hard against the wound in my shoulder with a focus that had nothing left in it of the woman who'd once stood on that dark highway with her arms crossed, daring the entire night to try something. The rain hadn't stopped. It hit the glass behind us in the same static rhythm from the very beginning of all this, except now there was blood soaking into white fabric instead of headlights reflecting off wet asphalt, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me considerably more than any bullet ever had, exactly how far 6 days had managed to carry the two of us. My hands shook, once. I hid it by gripping the edge of the sofa hard enough to whiten my own knuckles, a small private betrayal I didn't want her to witness on top of everything else she'd already been forced to witness that night. "Don't you dare cry for me now," I said, because her eyes had gone glassy and I could not sit there and watch her come apart over something as small, in the grand accounting of my life, as my own blood, when men had died by my own hand for reasons that mattered less than what she'd just survived. Minda. She didn't stop pressing the wound. She didn't stop looking at me either. I caught her wrist, not to still her hands, but because I needed, for what may have been the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, to hold on to something that wasn't a weapon, wasn't a contract, wasn't a name I was protecting purely out of inherited obligation, rather than anything resembling love. "There's something I haven't told you about your father," I said. Dawn came in gray and reluctant through the penthouse glass while I told her the rest of it, haltingly, because I am not a man built for confession, and every sentence cost me something I didn't have much practice spending. My mother, the road she died on, the word accident I'd carried for 27 years like a stone I'd silently agreed with myself never to turn over and examine, her father's file, the shipping manifests I'd once falsified to protect a truth I didn't yet know I was protecting, the Song family's decades-long insulation from a crime that would end them the moment it saw honest daylight. "He wasn't investigating an insurance claim," I said. "He was investigating a murder. Mine, well, my mother's, and somewhere along the way, the Songs found out he was close, and I think that's why." I stopped mid-sentence, something I have never once had to do in 11 years of running this family's business. "And I think that's why your car was run off that road before mine ever found you. You weren't collateral damage in something larger. You were the actual target. I simply got there first." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Grief has a particular silence to it, one I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself for most of my adult life, and I watched her wear it now, watched her understand, in real time, exactly what her father's final year of work had actually cost him, and how close it had come to costing her the same. I told her, because it seemed suddenly unbearable not to, about the last morning I saw my mother alive, the smell of her perfume in the hallway, gardenia and something warmer underneath, the sound of her heels on the marble as she left for an appointment she never returned from. I was 14. I remember my father's face when the call came, and I remember, more clearly than I've let myself remember in years, the exact moment I watched him decide to stop grieving out loud and start grieving through acquisition instead. More territory, more leverage, more distance between himself and anything soft enough to be taken from him again. I became very good at what he taught me, I said. I am only now beginning to understand what it cost me to learn it. She reached for my hand then, the uninjured one, and I let her hold it. And for a moment neither of us said anything at all, and the silence between us felt like the first honest thing I had allowed inside that penthouse in years. My phone rang before either of us could find whatever came next. Taemin's voice came through tight in a register I'd only heard from him twice before in 11 years. "Sir, it's Minister Song. He says if you don't hand her over by morning, he releases the accident file himself, reframed, made to look like your family covered up his. He's not asking this time." The boardroom on the 58th floor was thick with cigarette smoke and the particular silence of men deciding, in real time, whether 11 years of loyalty was worth more than their own survival. 4 of my father's oldest lieutenants sat around that table. 3 of them, by the end of the first 10 minutes, made it clear they wanted Amara handed over before sunrise. "She's one woman, Ji-hoon," old Park said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man talking someone down from a ledge he genuinely didn't want them to jump from. "The empire is thousands of lives, thousands of families. Your father would have made this trade before breakfast and never mentioned it again." "My father," I said, "spent 27 years lying to me about how my mother died in order to keep this family's peace intact. I am done inheriting his silences. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. But every man at that table went still in the particular way rooms go still when they understand, all at once, that the person speaking has already reached his decision and is only now informing them of it as a courtesy, not as an invitation to debate." Park's jaw worked once, twice, and then he settled back into his chair without another word, and I understood that whatever authority I still held in that room had just cost me something with him that I might never fully get back. I turned toward the door and found her standing in it. She'd clearly heard all of it. The trade proposed, the trade refused, my father's name invoked and discarded in the same breath. Before I could cross the room to reach her, the first gunshot came from the lobby 58 floors below, and the coup that Song had spent months quietly buying inside my own house finally announced itself in the only language men like that have ever truly spoken. For half a second, no longer, the room simply listened. Every man at that table had heard gunfire before. Most of them had caused it at one point or another, in service of my father or his father before him. But hearing it rise up through your own building, through floors you believed were secure, produces a very particular kind of silence. I have felt it exactly twice before in my life. Both times, I lost someone I couldn't afford to lose. I was not going to lose this time. I crossed the room to Amara first, before I gave a single order, before I reached for the weapon in the drawer beneath the head of that table. I put myself between her and the door, and only then did I turn to the room and start issuing the commands that would end, one way or another, before the sun finished rising over that skyline. I have ended wars in silence before. This one, I ended the only other way I know how. The men who came for us that night were Song's, bought and slowly inserted into my own security detail over months I hadn't had the vigilance to catch, a failure I would carry with me long after that night ended, though not that night, not while there was still work left to finish. I moved through my own penthouse the way I was raised to move through violence, cold and economical, each decision made before the last one had even finished executing. And by the time the last body hit the marble in the east hallway, the silence that followed it was the loudest sound I'd heard in the entire 6 days since a rental car died on a dark highway. Park, who 6 hours earlier had argued for trading her away, stood in the wreckage of the boardroom with both hands raised, finally, and completely understanding exactly whose family this had become somewhere in the last week without his full permission. I looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. Some debts get settled in silence, too. I found Amara exactly where I'd left her, unharmed, glass and gunpowder still hanging in the air around her, watching me cross the ruined room toward her with blood on my knuckles that wasn't mine. I did not care, in that particular moment, what it looked like to the 11 surviving men still standing witness in that room, every one of them present for the sight of the Kang syndicate's untouchable heir, a man who had not raised his voice in 11 years of running this family, going down on one knee on marble slick with his enemy's blood, and taking her shaking hand in both of mine. "You are not my collateral," I said, loud enough for every man remaining in that room to hear it clearly and understand it as the only order that would ever again outrank my own. "You are not my wife of convenience. Every decision made inside this house, from tonight forward, answers to you before it answers to me." The room bowed, every man in it, one after another, the way they had only ever bowed for my father before me. I stood, finally, my shoulders screaming where the earlier wound had reopened somewhere in the last 20 minutes of violence, and looked around at what remained of the room I had grown up believing I would inherit clean. It was not clean. It had never been clean. I understood, standing there with her hand still in mine, that I had spent 11 years mistaking control for peace, and that the two were not, and had perhaps never been, the same thing at all. Tae-min appeared in the doorway a moment later, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his either, breathing hard from whatever he'd just finished on the floors below, and gave me the smallest nod, the report I didn't need spoken aloud to understand. The building was secure. The threat, for tonight, was over. Whatever came next would come in daylight, with lawyers and ledgers instead of gunfire, and I found I had no appetite left for any of it beyond the woman standing in front of me. It was Amara, eyes still wet, hand still gripping mine as though she hadn't yet allowed herself to believe the danger had actually passed, who noticed what none of the rest of us, myself included, had thought to look for. One of Song's lieutenants was missing from the count of the dead, and taped beneath the boardroom table, in a place no one had thought to search, sat a second flash drive that did not belong to her father. I looked at it for a long time before I said anything. Whatever war I believed had just ended in that room was, I understood in that instant, only the first of however many still waited for us, and for the first time in 11 years of running this family, I found that the thought of what came next did not frighten me the way it should have, because I would not be facing it alone.